بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ولي المؤمنين وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله سيد ولد آدم أجمعين وبعد. We thank each and every single one of you for taking time out of the first Tuesday of this month to join us for How Do I Know? Why Islam? It's going to be a new series that we do. Depending on how much you like it, we may go ahead and see how to do this more frequently, inshallah. We know that we have people tuning in from all over the DFW area. We even got some people tuning in from different parts of the country, and we see our sisters even shaking and moving and driving while she's here in the class. May Allah preserve her and her family. Allahumma ameen. Eyes on the road. So we thank each and every single one of you for coming. Um, this series is definitely going to require you to interact. Now, is it going to be an hour? Yes and no. If you need to leave at 8 or 9 respectively, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh in advance. You do not have to spam the chat saying that you need to leave. Realistically, we'll probably end closer to 7:15 or 8:15, 8:30 Eastern or Central Standard Time. So just keep that in mind. The reason for that is because we definitely want to hear from you. Now, the topic that we're going to be discussing is, I wouldn't even say that it's controversial. I would just say that it's a conversation that people have often, and it's kind of one of those ongoing, never-ending type of things where people they have these dialogues and it never really comes to an end. And the reason for that is because oftentimes when it comes to these types of discussions, everybody feels like they're an authority. Whenever you take objective dialogues and you reduce it to subjective conclusions, then everyone can always add to it. I'm in a lot of group chats. Some of you are in those chats with me. Sometimes you'll have people who don't know anything about fiqh. They will insert their opinion, they will insert their perspective, even though that's not the way that we approach understanding the difference between right and wrong. These are not subjective conversations because we say that there are objective realities, objective truths, objective moralities, right? So when I say God, the atrocious argument of attrition, I say it's atrocious because it's ugly how sometimes, the society that we live in, we're more pro talking about sexuality than spirituality. You can identify as whatever gender you want. That's no problem. But hey, man, don't talk about God. Like, come on, man. People get killed over stuff like that, man. Like, oh, you trying to be religious now? People, they get uncomfortable when you start talking about religiosity. But when it comes to like sexual preference or gender identity and fluidity and so on and so forth, everybody is comfortable. We want to change that. We want to change that. So this new series, we're going to start with the conversation about God, and we're going to go really, really deep. So I need you to pull some Blue's Clues and put on your thinking cap and sit in your thinking chair because we're going to have to really strap in for this one. Normally, when I give talks, I'm a very flawed public speaker. Very flawed public speaker. I make inappropriate jokes because I'm the funniest person I know. Ha 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 ha. And I'm just generally awkward. It's the way that I kind of like release tension from myself. But for this conversation in particular, for this dialogue in particular, this is going to be something where I need you to understand this is a safe space for discussion. But I do not want any of you to get on your own soapbox and go on a 5-minute tangent about what you think and you feel. I'm going to lay the groundwork for you as we talk about the logical, emotional, and social arguments for God's existence. And then I want you to pick your favorite discourse within this framework, and I want you to tell me why this is right or it's wrong. Okay? Now, I was going to put you in breakout rooms for you to break out with each other and figure out ways to break out this conversation, break it up, break it down, and then come back and break it down for all of us all together. But clearly, the majority being the authority, nobody wants to do that. And alhamdulillah for the power of choice, even if it's illusionary sometimes. If you all enjoyed this series, then we'll do the same thing for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam once we finish this. Logical, emotional, and social arguments on how we know the Prophet Muhammad was sent by God Almighty. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So who is this class for? Because the class is only as beneficial as the audience that it's tailored towards, and the class is only as good as its audience. First up, it's here to inspire. I put aspire. It's here to inspire people who want to do da'wah. So if you are an aspiring da'i, or you are someone who needs to be inspired to do da'wah, we got your back like your shirt. Alhamdulillah. We're here for it. If you are someone who has doubts about Islam, or you need some your own assurances, We're going to start with the concept of God. This is not an Aqidah class. We have a different forum for that. We have a different platform for that. This is a dawah class, first and foremost, to educate people who want to learn how to give dawah, to empower them with very strong arguments, as well as talk about counterpoints. But if you have doubts, this will be the class where we get to discuss it. But I want you to make sure that you stay within the realm of doubts based on this discussion. If you have questions about God's existence, you can ask them here. But do not ask me for fatwa. Do not ask me for fiqh rulings. Don't ask me about anything like that. That's not the forum for this. And there are plenty of people in other places that get paid to answer questions like that. If you really need to ask me, then of course you can. But preferably save it for the very, very end. Try to stay within the framework of this discussion. All right? You know, sometimes we give a talk about holidays and somebody wants to ask the ruling of, slavery in Islam. It's like, come on, man. We're not, it's something else. So let's stay within the framework of this, okay? And people who are interested in learning about Islamic theology, we have from our brothers and sisters in humanity, we have a lot of different people. We have a lot of different people from our brothers and sisters in humanity who are here to just hear the discourse about God. I'll tell you this right now. We're not just going to be talking about the Islamic version of things. We don't even think like that. When it comes to truths, truths are standalone doctrines. In fact, in Islam, there's a concept known as wahdatul haqq. Wahdatul haqq. That's uniform, universal, complete and total singular truth. The truth cannot be compartmentalized into 5 or 10 or 20 different things. We say that when there is a truth, it's one. And Allah mentions it 13 times in the Quran, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to break your brain with that. Meaning, when Allah says al-haq has come, he's talking about the singular truth that your Lord is one. So that means that someone else cannot come and say, well, no, your Lord is 5. Or there's a pantheon of gods, or it's a difference of opinion. There's no room for that here. So for those of you who want to hear about the Islamic theology, we're going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about some other stuff too. Okay? Now, frequently asked questions. Is this class recorded? Due to the mercy of the people in this class, for those of you who are watching this in the future, all 3 of you, may Allah reward you. Yes, this class is recorded. For all 3 of you who took the time to open this potentially 1 hour and 30-minute long video, may Allah reward you and me. What are the prerequisites to this class? None, except that you are a good note taker. And if you were not before, then become one right now. Be ready to take notes, okay? If you want to learn about more dawah opportunities, more classes in the future, here's this link. Let me go ahead and send it to you in the chat right now. Feel free to join the WhyIslam Ansar chat. I'm gonna send it to you. You can go in it. This is not a chat for you to spam random fundraisers or random things that no one else really wants to ask about. This is a chat exclusively for dawah related things. If you want to know about what we're doing with WhyIslam, classes and opportunities to do dawah, this is the chat for that. We have a chat for sisters who want to ask fiqh questions. We have a chat for bros who want to talk about whatever comes to their mind, from sports to anime and everything in between. We have chats for all of those things, but this chat is not the chat for that, right? Just so that you're aware. If you want to learn more about Islam as a non-Muslim or a new Muslim or a Muslim, born Muslim who may have different questions and stuff, or if you know someone who has doubts or questions or whatever have you, feel free to have them email me, inshallah. I do Zoom meetings. Now, if you reach out to me and you ask me to like send you a dissertation or an essay, I'm sorry, I don't do that. Okay? Sorry, I do not do that. But if you want to like meet on Zoom for like 20 minutes or something like that, we can accommodate you, inshallah. All right? Now, before we get started, are there any questions, comments, concerns, additions, omissions, suggestions, or objections to anything that we shared? Good. Let's get into this. Now, I'm going to lay the groundwork for 3 fundamental arguments that are used for God's existence. I'm going to kind of breeze through it a little bit quick because I need you to capture the premise of all 3. Okay? Capture the premise of all 3 of these arguments for God's existence. Nod if you're following along. Nod, please, Maha. Nod. Okay, yes, I can see you. Good. And again, for all of our brothers and sisters in Islam who joined late, may Allah reward you. This is a cam-on meeting. If you can't turn your camera on, please do. We appreciate those of you who have, and we ask Allah to make it easy for those of you who cannot, and me. So here's some key terms that I need you to kind of keep in mind here, all right? And these are philosophical terms. The first is a priori. It's not a priori. It's a priori. That means from reason. It's something that is derived from reason. A posteriori. A posteriori. Now, we're not talking about some pasta. We're not talking about some pasta ravioli. You know, it ain't nothing like that. A posteriori, this means from experience, right? So we're talking about different forms of inductive reasoning. We're talking about different ways that people come to different types of conclusions, different ways that people understand things. These two words are important because different arguments for and against God's existence are predicated upon either experiential knowledge, what have I experienced, or predicated upon logic and reason. What do I know and what makes sense to me? We need to be able to move from the subjectivity of a person's individual experience on why I believe to why we should all believe. We need to be able to move from the individual logic and reason of one person saying, well, I think, and in my opinion, I feel, to what should we all think about this subject matter. Without further ado, let me share this with you, Bars. So is God real? That's going to be the premise that we get into for today. Is God real? Now, if you want, actually, I'll take this one by one so that we don't overwhelm you too much, right? The first of three primary arguments that are used to argue God's existence is known as the ontological argument. The ontological argument for God's existence. This is under a sub-science of epistemology, of the branches of knowledge known as ontology. And this is the concept that deals with the nature of being in and of itself, like something that does exist. So concepts within a subject that shows the relationship between two different things is known as ontology. Yeah, we done turned this into a classroom. Don't worry, at least it's being recorded for all four of you now who will go back and watch this. So ontology, it deals with concepts within a subject that shows the relationship between two things. Now, when we start talking about the ontological argument for God's existence, when we start talking about God, how is that defined? It's defined as the following. Now, this is a combination of three of the primary arguments that are used when discussing the nature of God's existence. God is maximally great. Maximally great. God is greater than can be conceived, meaning the greatness of God is at its absolute maximum. And the maximally great being of which nothing can be greater. So when you say God in ontology, you're saying God is greater than everything. And keep in mind, it's a non-Muslim. They're not even saying Allahu Akbar, but that's how they describe God. All right. If you have a question, post it in the chat while we get through this. Now, if reality exists, it's how the argument goes, how this philosophical argument for God's existence goes. If reality exists, then what is greater than it must exist as well. Okay. So if we live in a universe, then something that is greater than the universe must exist. And if you can think of God, then God is whatever is greater than you can think of. This is the first explanation. Keep in mind, this explanation comes from non-Muslims. It actually, the fundamental basis of this argument comes from a man named Anselm. He was a Christian. Anselm, also known as Saint Anselm, who wrote a book called Prosologilium. And this book was actually written 400 years after the Prophet ﷺ was on the earth, for those of you who care. 1000 CE. All right. So the argument or the claim of ontology is this: God is defined as that which is greater than can be conceived. So God is absolutely omnipotent, meaning completely powerful, right? God is absolutely omniscient, meaning absolute knowledge, and God is totally perfect, meaning there can be no imperfection when it comes to the nature of God, all right? And since it is beyond what can be imagined, the minute you can think of God, it can't be God anymore. Now, look, this is a Christian saying that. And, you know, Christians believe in Jesus as the Son of God. But because of this argument, St. Anselm, he said, no, you can perceive the Son of God, but you can't perceive God itself. God is greater than what can be conceived. Just to kind of give you some background on that. Now, I'm going to go through the argument, and it is a little bit confusing, but I just want you to keep the premise, keep the claim, okay? So this is how Anselm used to go about arguing for God's existence. Just follow along with this madness, okay? Whenever he would talk to a person, he would assume that that person does not believe God exists. So he would then define God. He would say God is greater than what can be conceived. And then if that then which no greater can be conceived must therefore not exist. This is the argument of the person. So what they would say is, well, if I can't think of it, it can't be real. So he said, that which is greater than can be conceived, it can only exist in your imagination. If it's greater than what you can actually think of, then it means that it's something that you have to imagine. So then he would go on and say, if that then which no greater can be conceived were to exist in reality as well as imagined, then it would be greater. This is philosophy for you. If it can be in your imagination and it can be in reality, then it must be greater than great. So then he would say, but that would mean that what you're saying is greater than can be conceived and what you can imagine, then it can't be imagined at all. And he would say, yes, you're right, because it would be greater than even that. And that means that God either does not exist or does exist at the same time. So then from there, that means that the first thing cannot be true. So that means that God is real. Pause. Time out, coach. What do you think about this argument? In 30 seconds or less. What do you think about this argument? This conversation puts Inception to shame. That's funny.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't know where to look. I have two devices open. One is for me to be able to speak better. But I don't know. I guess here. Yes, I'm gonna go with that. It's interesting because it implies, and I guess to some extent would explain why it says that God is like inside of us, you know. Because if you can perceive something great, then that means that, I mean, there is something in you from God, right?
Well, no, according to Anselm, if you can say that God is inside of you, then that can't be God, because you can imagine something inside of you.
Yeah, but yeah, I understand. But what I'm trying to suggest is this: it says that if you can imagine something that is greater than reality, I mean, granted, you cannot really even get there, but it means that there is something greater. They're using that logic to explain that even reality as, I don't know if that explains. I don't know if it is. I don't
All
know
right,
if I'm being explained it enough.
I hear what you're saying, but let's hear from some other people too. Abul Qasim, he said he confused himself trying to understand it. Jose, aka Brose, he said it's a lot to absorb. Sayyid Sheikh Ashfaq, he said it's too much to conceive. Sadaf said brain explodes. Ahmed said,
Okay.
if God, well, hold on, let me read this one real quick.
Mm-hmm.
If God exists, shouldn't there be something greater? By that logic, at least. I like that. I like that, Ahmed. I like that. And
Thanks.
yeah, all right, go ahead, Isra.
It took me a second, but it's a lot of back and forth, and from what I understand, it's the conversation is only as intelligent as the person having the conversation. So if the person is ignorant to begin with, and they're like, no, but when I can't imagine it, how can I trust that there is a God if I can't imagine it? I need some proof. And you're insistent that a God can't be proven, and that's the proof itself. Then it's a, to me, it's a false argument in the sense that it can't be proven, or it doesn't satisfy the person asking the question, because at the end of the day, your argument needs to be able to satisfy the other person's curiosity, or their any intellectually profound questions that they might be battling with. Your answer needs to satisfy that at the end of the day. At least that's my understanding of it in terms of da'wah. That how do you tell somebody about something, or how do you invite them to something that they're not even ready to understand yet? So there would be one part that they're ready, the other part would be are they willing? And the willing part is a separate conversation. This part, this specific issue, to me seems more of an understanding than a willingness part.
So let me just add to what you said, because this is how Anselm looked at it. He said only a fool would say that I don't want to believe in something I can't think of. Because there's stuff all the time that you can't actually imagine that you believe in. So only in his argument, he referred to anyone who is an atheist, he only called them fools. Only a fool would say, I don't believe in God because I can't think of God. He's saying God is greater than what can be conceived. So why would you reject the notion of God just because you can't conceive it? That doesn't make any sense. So that was his approach. Now, send a 1 in the chat if you would use this as an argument, and send a 2 if you think that it's too flawed.
I kind of think it's flawed. And back to the question that I asked earlier, if I could expand on it.
Sure.
So earlier you said, if you believe something great exists, then there has to be something greater.
Mm-hmm.
So if I already believe a God exists, does that mean there's something greater?
This is actually one of the logical fallacies that existed, that was pointed out in this argument. But we're going to point out the fallacies temporarily.
Oh.
We'll essentially be answering your question short.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I like to play 5D chess in my talks. Can someone look? I see a lot of twos. Don't be hating on my boy Ansem. It sounds good. We as Muslims, we even say that. Allahu Akbar. Aqulu qawli hada. I'm done. That's the end of the talk. It's like, yeah, we say Allahu Akbar all the time. We say that Allah is greater than what can be perceived. We say that Allah is not subject to your imagination. So now somebody who is daring enough, preferably someone we haven't heard from, give me an argument using this, like put it in front of me. Does anyone want to try? Really, y'all don't like this argument? We still got two more. We don't have to dwell. I just want you to be aware. No one?
Are you asking us to give you a better argument, or what are you asking?
Use this argument, unless you really just don't like it. Y'all really don't like this one. There's a lot of twos. I don't think I got a single one. All right, bet. I'll use it. When it comes to the concept of God Almighty, when we're talking about the creator of the universe as we know it and don't know it, then that being would have to be greater than what you could possibly imagine. There are things that exist within our universe that are beyond our own comprehension. For example, dark matter makes up 97% of the universe, and most of its functions we do not even truly understand. The implications of quantum mechanics and different theoretical physics ideas, for example, scientific theories predicated in a lot of scientific evidence. For example, multiversal theory, many worlds, M theory, string theory, the possibility that there could be multiple existences and within a single plane, Schrodinger's cat, we can go on and on. There's a lot of things that you can't imagine. So why is it as a scientist, you would accept things that exist in the universe that you cannot fully understand, but then reject the notion of God just because you can't understand it? That doesn't make any sense. It only makes sense to know that God is greater than what you can make sense of, and to accept that God would have to be greater than what you can even think of. Do you like the argument better this way? Send a 1 if you like that. All right, so Sister Winnie, she said, almost all humans know that there's more in existence, and we accept that whatever it is beyond what we conceive. However, when it comes to God, we suddenly don't believe that an inconceivable God can exist, which may be why we have Jesus as God, because it makes God conceivable. I really like that point a lot. You see how across cultures, people try to make God into something conceivable? We even live in a society where people say that's godlike. Bro, did you see that combo? It's a godlike combo. Bro, those shoes are godlike. He's godlike. He's a god. She's a god. This is godlike. Bro, did you hear that album? Oh my God, he's a rap god. Even Eminem called himself a rap god. Like, this is the world that we live in where everything can be godlike. Some of you grew up watching Avatar. Some of you are binge watching it. Well, you should be paying attention in school. May Allah forgive you and me. Avatar is a synonym for God. The little Aang is a little god. Yes, that's what the word means. So yes, it's shirk. No, bro, it's no fatwa. I swear it's not a fatwa. I swear. It's haram. It's haram. No, I'm kidding. I'm joking. So when it comes to these words, you can see, look, Odin, Thor, the whole MCU. Thor is the god of thunder. You love Thor, Ragnarok. You watching it. You here for it, right? So when we put the argument in this way, I'm sure it does sound a little bit better. See, Ansem lived about 1,000 years ago, so the way that he's gonna say it is gonna be a little archaic. But when you break it down like that, does it make sense? Now tell me what's wrong with it. What's wrong with what I just said? Don't make me start calling on you if I haven't heard from you yet. I will. Sister Reda. You knew you were gonna be first. What's wrong with my argument? Huh?
Stats, to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out Ansem's argument, so I'm like really lost.
Hey, if you get lost, just you can give me a hand signal. You can do bird calls. You start whistling and we'll get it. If you get lost, let me know. And we pump the brakes, inshallah. So Ansem's
Okay.
argument.
You want a response to yours or not? You want to move on because
let me explain it to Sister Rida so that she at least So Ansem's argument is God is greater than what can be conceived intellectually. So if you reject the notion of what you can perceive by way of God, then you're a fool. Why would you reject the notion of something that you can't think of? You will never be able to think of God. So you're just going to disbelieve in God? That doesn't make any sense. That's his point. Ali Jawad said, the problem with that argument, I know it might be nitpicky, but someone could say that those scientific examples you gave have some proofs in math. I like that. Now we have some delete. We have some evidence. Jake, responding to Sister Winnie, mentioned, I think that's not an accurate depiction of Christian perspective of who Jesus is. The Jesus perspective doesn't portray Jesus as God because they want to ascribe God to an object. It's because that's who Christians believe Jesus claimed himself to be, which is a really important point that Jake made. And if you attend our comparative religious studies classes, we talk about that. Some of you all know very well. Not only do I have a background in philosophy, but I was a youth minister for 8 years and went to Christian seminary school. And my primary focus was actually interdenominational studies. And the ascription of divinity to Jesus across denominations varies. Normally in the Bible, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but the primary proofs that are used to say that Jesus was divine are the 8 I am statements that you find in the book of John, John 1:1, which is used as a proof for the Trinity, and the epistles of Paul, which elevated Jesus to the status of of being more divine. But if you look in the earliest Christian scriptures, for example, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, the Didact, whenever you look at the oldest Christian scriptures, which have some 14,000 differences between that and the King James Version of the Bible that was produced in 1611 and ratified in the 16th century afterwards, we find that those ascriptions of divinity were later added. And this goes against the principle of the second of the 10 commandments, which is found in the book of Exodus and also in the book of Deuteronomy, but that's neither here nor there. Umayma said, technically, it might be a good reason to someone to already believes in God, but it would sound like a circular argument to one who thinks otherwise. Yes, Umayma, that is right. That is the problem with this argument. It's literally right here, but I wrote it in Latin. Reductio ad absurdum. And no, this ain't Harry Potter. This ain't Harry Potter. This ain't no expecto patronum. You know what I'm saying? Reductio ad absurdum, it means it's a cyclical argument. You have to keep repeating yourself again and again and again. You have to make people believe your definition. And so if someone already believes in God like Ansem did, who was, of course, a Christian, he already had some basis of faith, but he used this logical argument to even say that the concept of God is even greater than the concept of Christ. That's why Christ itself is a part of God, but not God itself. That God would be greater than can be conceived. You can see how you run into a few different issues there. God has said, I think it's a little apples to oranges to compare it to, as there is some science or math to back things such as string theory, Schrodinger's cat. Now look, apples and oranges are all fruit. So you see how oftentimes when we start to try to draw these parallels between philosophy and stuff, many times you have to force the square through the circle shape. And we're gonna go deeper into that. Now keep in mind, this is not my argument. It's not my argument. I'm just putting it in front of y'all. Sehak said, I think that this would be the equivalent of those as a sort of proof. Yeah. And here's the thing too, Lil Wayne say numbers don't lie, but at the same time, like sometimes you can use some stuff to bring some different things. I was watching a lecture earlier with a brother who was showing me how they were making an argument for God using the concept of a virtual reality of this plane, using so much scientific research. I ended up saying none of this makes sense because of X, Y, and Z. But if you just listen to it, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, because you can forge a lot of stuff like that. Those comparative religious studies classes, I'm sure exist somewhere, but your boy hates being recorded the same way that some celebrities hate being photographed. Shout out Kanye. Anyways, When it comes to this ontological argument, let me tell you what's wrong with it. Let me tell you what's wrong with it. First, we run into a little bit of a word salad. What does that mean? What do you mean by great? God is greater than can be conceived. What do you mean by great? What do you mean by maximum? You see, whenever you can take a definition, you can say it means whatever you want, then that means that the concept will immediately become subjective. What if the greatest thing that I can imagine is an alien with multiple arms and multiple hands that exists, and with its multiple arms and multiple hands, well, I don't even know what it's like, so I just think that God is an alien. You see how somebody can use their own imagination to then justify what is great, what is maximum, right? The other issue is we don't have to accept the first premise of God. We don't have to accept this definition. And if you run into a strong enough atheist, they're not going to take your definition of God. And that's something that Umayma had pointed out. If someone believes in God, sure, they'll say, yeah, God is greater than what can be perceived. But if someone is just like, I don't believe in anything, you're going to tell me God is greater than anything? Well, I don't believe in a God in the first place. The other issue is when you postulate one possibility, meaning when you put forward one idea, that means that you can't eliminate its alternative logically. And for those of you who want to do dawah, I want you to avoid these logical fallacies of pigeonholing yourself and painting yourself in a corner. Painting yourself in a corner where you become so consumed with your little scientific miracles and your little explanation of stuff that now once someone is like, and now what? You just like, you start hyperventilating, you start sweating. The thing is, if you say God is greater than that can be perceived, then I can say, well, what if God doesn't need to be conceived in the first place? What if I say God doesn't need to be in the first place? The minute you put forward this possibility, I can automatically say the opposite of it too. And you'll notice, especially for those of you who try to talk about Islam with your friends and stuff, you bring up one thing, they may bring up the polar opposite. You say this, they'll say that. You think this, I say that. Even for people who are here who are not Muslims, you may run into the same thing. If you believe in a higher power, or even if you don't believe in a higher power, you will run into someone who says the opposite. So the other issue with this is that this argument can be flipped very, very easily. And our sister Amethyst, she shared the link to the comparative religious studies classes, by the way. But I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to share all of these points because maybe it's too hard. I will tell you right now, the ontological argument is honestly the most complicated, but it would be a disservice if I didn't share it with you because it is a well-used argument by many people. Even if they don't know it, they use this formula often. But the point is, people don't have to accept this formula. They don't have to accept this premise. And the minute that you say that God is greater than can be conceived, you can easily say, well, I don't conceive God at all. Does anyone have any questions about ontology before we move to the next one? I swear it gets easier from here. This is the weeding out process. This is okay. We ready to move to the next one? It's not too much. Hamza, how we doing? All right, bet. I think Allah is taking care of all our perceptions at the same time we perceive and conceive. Allah is taking care of that for us to know him, but we need to know him. Allah sent multiple religions and different people to help us learn and understand this guidance. By that learning in itself, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all we know and what we don't know. All we know is what Allah has given us. Now, the truth is, using the same type of vernacular, first off, we have a source of authority on Allah, and that's none of our opinions. And we're going to talk about that. So while this does sound good in theory, we cannot operate on theory when it comes to God. We have to have a source from which that comes from. So does the Quran say this? Like, where do we get these types of concepts from? In the Quran, Allah says the only religion for Allah is Islam. So you see how Allah did not send multiple. Allah even says in Surah Al-Baqarah, at the end of the or right at the beginning of the second juz, or just before the beginning of the second juz in the Quran, that if Allah looked, they were all supposed to be upon the one religion, the one path, but they have the right to choose. They all chose different things. So you can see that, like, even like how we come to understand those things, Allah is not an oppressor. God does not make you do anything. So you do have a choice, and that's why we're here to discuss what we choose when it comes to how we believe in God. So now let's talk about cosmology. Now, this is an argument that you'll see a lot of famous people use when it comes to arguing for God's existence. Cosmology. So the concept of cosmology and epistemology, branches of knowledge, is the concept of an origin and the development of the universe. Okay? So that's where this is all coming from. Now, when it comes to God, the cosmological argument for God, it goes as follows. God is the first cause of every single effect. Everything that you know that is, God is the origin point of it. Now, keep in mind, this argument came from non-Muslims, but Muslims have their own version of this known as the Kalam cosmological argument. I've taken all three of the primary cosmological arguments and consolidated it into this singular argument. But the claim, the premise that I want you to keep from this is as follows. The universe and everything in it must have a cause, and this cause can only be God. The universe and everything in it, it must have a cause, and that cause, it can only be God. Does that sound nice? You like that? It's okay? Ibrahim. Does this sound crunchy, crispy, crunchy chicken? So here's the argument. Everything comes into being, everything that comes into being, it must have a first cause, okay? Now, if for every finite and contingent thing, and by the way, the word contingent means dependent. Contingent means dependent, meaning you need something. For every finite, meaning limited, and contingent, meaning dependent thing, it has to have a cause. And an infinite regress. Now, when we say infinite regress, that means an infinite amount of cause and effects. You cannot just have some ongoing loop of things just causing an effect with no start point. That is impossible. It's impossible to just have an infinite amount of cause and effect without having an origin point, right? And this is an a posteriori argument, by the way. The last one was an a priori argument. This is an a posteriori one, meaning from experience. You will never ever see something in this universe that is infinitely cause and effect and doesn't have an origin. You will never ever see a caterpillar turn into a cocoon to a butterfly back to a cat. No. It has a start and an end, right? It's kind of like the chicken and the egg argument. Either way, there's a cause and there's an effect, but you have to have a starting point, you see? So because of this, because it can't be an infinite regress, that's impossible. You cannot observe an infinite regress. We must therefore arrive at a first cause. We have to go to where the origin point is, because there needs to be something that does not need to be a first cause. You understand? Or there needs to be something that doesn't need to be an effect. So that first cause, it can only be God. Because if there's a dependent being that exists in any given set, in a world, in a planet, in a wherever, then that means there needs to be at least one necessary being that is not dependent on anything. And a necessary existence is needed in order for there to be existence. Yes, Hassan, an uncaused cause. You can't have, you have to have an uncaused cause. A first cause is what it's called. All right, so Ahmedi asked, if God made everything, then what made God? This is actually a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is actually one of the logical fallacies of this argument. Ahmed, you keep playing 5D. I thought I was playing 5D chess. Your questions are 6D. We're going to get to that point. But I just want you to focus on the argument itself for now. So here's some of the conditions of this argument. This is what makes it valid. There's no such thing as self-causation, because you cannot observe self-causation. You are never just going to see like a butterfly like turn itself into a caterpillar. You know, there's not going to happen like that. That would be freaky. It would freak me out if I just saw a butterfly just like shed its wings and like lose its antennas and like turn into a squirmy thing again. I'm like, oh, I'll throw up. So you can't observe that. The next is you cannot have an infinite regression. One example of like, if you want to picture an infinite regress in your mind, think of a chain that has like links and links and links and links and links, chain link, chain link, chain link. And it just keeps going. There's no end to the link. There's no first link. It's just an infinite rope with no first thread. And the reason why this is important is because we know the universe has a beginning. We do not say that there's no theory that says that the universe is eternal, right? And the third condition is the uniqueness and the identity of that first cause. We know that this is God because God would be the only thing that fits the conditions necessary to be the first cause. So, what do you think of this argument? Send a 1 if you like it, send a 2 if you don't. Sarah, why don't you like it? You didn't like any of them so far. So now sent a 3. Yes, go ahead.
I feel like for this, you would have to believe in God anyway. Because by saying that the only possible first cause was God, you would have to believe in the concept of God.
I like that. I like that. The reason why I like that is because for most people, when they say first cause, they're not talking about like a God that's meant to be worshipped or anything. They're just talking about a deity. It has to be. So when oftentimes people say God, they think religion. These arguments are not predicated upon religion. It's just predicated upon the concept of God itself. That's why it's meant to be a logical argument, because some people would argue that religion is illogical, but like theology itself is illogical, but belief in a deity is logical. That's why you have some people who are atheists. They believe in a higher power, but they don't believe in organized religion. An atheist is someone who is opposed to theology. Theology is what composes organized religion. An atheist is someone who is completely against deism, meaning they don't believe in any form of a higher power or deity whatsoever. So you will find that not every atheist is an atheist. Some of them, I just think Christianity is dumb. That's how they feel. I just think Islam is terrorism. That's how they think. I just think all religion is dumb. They'll quote Karl Marx. It's the opium of the masses. They talk like that. So here, I want you to remove the concept of religion from your mind, right? So I see a lot of like 2s still. I see a 1.5. I was asked by.
I also had a comment on this argument.
Okay, please go ahead.
It made sense when we were talking about how it can't be an infinite regression. We can't have an infinite existence. There has to be a cause. But then it makes me wonder, like putting myself in the shoes of someone who's trying to be convinced by this argument, then if you're saying infinite regression isn't possible, but is the concept of God not based on infinite regression, that he has no beginning or end, that he always was? So this argument is kind of problematic in terms of the existence of God.
Yo, Roseanne and Ahmed are killing it. Umeme killed it with the first one. They coming in with the sledgehammer for this one. I like it. I like seeing stuff get picked apart. You know, there's a really good point. And I actually mentioned the fallacy of this argument right here, if you hadn't noticed. The issue with this argument is that it's known as special conditionality, or known as special pleading. You have to accept what I'm saying in order for my argument to work. What am I saying? That God is the first cause. If you can accept that, then everything else makes sense. So then people will then work backwards. Can something come from nothing? No. Okay. Then that means that the universe came from something. What is that something? It's God. So God is the first cause. God created everything in the universe. Repeat after me. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So they go like that, right? And Christians have their own version in apologetics of the cosmological argument too. Okay. So I was asked directly, how would you refute someone who says the universe is eternal? We're actually going to talk about this once we point out the fallacies more. We're going to talk about this. What if we as a person say there has to be a cause to every effect? Wouldn't that limit the imagination of humans? And this is actually another logical fallacy. I love how thinking this group is, mashallah. That's a really good point. Is the claim that there is nothing that comes into existence without cause an empirical argument? Yes, it is. It's meant to be an a posteriori one. And if it is, can a logical argument be made for that as well? So the thing that makes this an empirical argument and an a posteriori one that's experiential is because you can physically observe cause and effect. So some people say that a posteriori arguments are stronger because you can witness it. while logic does not necessarily need to witness something in order to affirm that it is true. See? This may be too deep. Let me know if I need to dial it back. If Allah is real, why is it so complicated to prove that there is God? It's not this complicated. We have not even used an Islamic argument yet. We have not used it. These are philosophical arguments. I'm teaching it to you so that maybe you find some good in it. Maybe you hate it. But what I share with you at the end will be, how do you know why it's not? 10D chess. I'm in a different dimension. Doesn't the Big Bang basically say that random combustion made everything? Actually, let's go ahead and point out the fallacies here. So here's the logical fallacy of the cosmological argument for God's existence. Keep in mind, we've not even shared the Islamic argument yet. It's much shorter than all of this, I can tell you that. So the Big Bang is four, or depending on the argument, three primary components coming and converging on a single point: time, space, and matter, or some added electromagnetism, converging on a point of singularity, right? And then that point of convergence causing a Big Bang that led to everything that is. Khalid said, so this argument would still be based on the collective empiricism of humans, and that we haven't seen anything that comes into being without cause. Yes, but now let's point out the logical fallacies of this argument. So the first is special pleading. Why do we assume God does not have a cause in an argument that says everything has a cause? Why would you assume that? So this is a type of special conditionality, and it implies a logical fallacy that is really hard to get around. In fact, using this same concept, a very, very famous scientific figure from the 80s and 90s by the name of Carl Sagan, very, very popular person. I remember watching his videos growing up. He said that the first cause is the universe itself. So he stopped the cosmological argument at the universe. And you can do that using the same argument. He called the universe the first cause. So then there's this concept of effects without causes. There are effects that exist without causes. And this kind of goes to Khalid's point. Just because it's never been experienced does not mean that it cannot be reasoned that not every effect has a cause. In fact, observing this so often is not a proof that effects without causes are logically impossible. Was forced into reading Sagan in 7th grade, vowed to never touch philosophy again. And now I have you drowning in the waters of philosophy. Astaghfirullah. Once we taste Islam, it'll be so much sweeter, I swear. I just have to put this bitterness on the tongue first to start. So David Hume, a famous philosopher, which we'll be talking about a lot when we talk about the social arguments for God's existence, he said we cannot infer that every cause needs an effect and that every effect needs a cause. And it's true. In fact, there are examples in science that shows that not every cause needs an effect and not every effect has a cause. And we're going to talk about that shortly. Another issue is when you use the cosmological argument, there could be multiple causes. For example, there's nothing to prevent this argument for allowing for there to be multiple causes. In fact, the Big Bang that Ahmed had pointed out is composed of time, space, and matter. Would you say that they're all first causes at the same time? Would you say that there are three gods? Would you call time God?
Personally, I find it really hard to prove the Big Bang, but it's just an argument that explains everything.
Right. And you know, Ahmed, that's a really good point that you made. I was actually talking to a brother earlier about how a lot of things that we have that we use often are really scientific theories because it's the best explanation. Not everything we use is a scientific law. For example, plate tectonics and continental drift, it's a scientific theory. Now, we have a lot of evidence that plate tectonics exists. We can look at volcanoes, we can look at earthquakes, we can see the Marianas Trench, we can see all of those things. We know that continents are moving, but it's still a theory. It has not reached a criteria to be a scientific law because it's the best working theory. So because of the cosmic background noise that exists from that proverbial Big Bang, that proves more validity for the theory, but it's still not quite at the level of a scientific law, right? So for now, it's just the best argument that is used for the origin of the universe.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, like, why can't I say your God isn't just the best argument that proves everything?
Well, because that would be a more subjective argument than looking at cosmic background noise. I can't see your God. I can see cosmic background noise. I can see the effects of a point of singularity exploding and leading to everything that we have. We can still see the effects of that to this day. The fact that the earth is spinning and there's sunrise and sunset is a proof that these things happen, even though it's still a scientific theory.
Well, that's
Yeah.
what I'm saying is, like, if there's this evidence, then what do you have to show that your God exists?
Oh, don't worry. I'm getting to mine. I'm
Thank you.
just taking my time. You know, I like to climb the mountain. If you can climb the mountain with me, then when we get to the top, we'll enjoy the view, inshallah. I know it's a little painstaking.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. So the last 2 points is there are stuff that exists in the universe that does not have a verifiable cause. Radioactive decay. Scientifically, atoms can randomly, for no reason whatsoever, disintegrate. What's the cause? We don't know. So then a person could say, well, just because you don't know doesn't mean it doesn't have a cause. Bruh, we don't know. It just happens. It's an effect. Similarly, there's this concept known as virtual particles. Even in a void or a vacuum, particles can randomly generate with no cause whatsoever. How? It's just an effect, right? So, but I'm not going to get into that because this is what some atheists use to kind of refute the verse in the Bible that says God said, "Let there be light." I don't want to get into that. I heard someone present the argument with a premise that said everything that begins to exist needs to have a cause, not that everything has a cause. Well, that's kind of the distinctions that exist between the different forms of the cosmological argument. It has 3 different types. The Kalam cosmological argument, Thomas Aquinas cosmological argument, and I forget the last thing in every list. So, so I don't remember the last one off the top of my head. The last one is too complicated. I'm not going to explain. Let's finish this up so I can take the 10 minutes necessary to explain the Islamic concept of this, because it's a lot shorter, I promise. And I'm going to tell you why I did this, so that you don't think I just did some random spiel. Like, trust me, everything has a purpose, even if everything doesn't have a cause. So now let's talk about teleology, which is the shortest of all of these arguments, alhamdulillah. Teleology is known as theological determinism. I know it's a big word. What it means is everything we see, I put every we see, let me just add this real quick. Everything we see has a design and thus it has a purpose. When you look at everything around you, you see design, right? So that means that it has a purpose. So what is the teleological argument for God's existence? It's the sign of intelligent design. The sign of intelligent design and purpose in the creation shows that a higher power caused everything to be the way that it is. Now, send a 1 in the chat if you like this one. Argument by design. Send a 2 if you think it kind of sucks. Because everything in the creation has intelligent design, that implies that a higher power, an intellectual power, created it. 2, evolution kind of debunks this. Ali. Oh man, I wasn't even gonna bring that up. It's one of the fallacies that got pointed out by this. Y'all are actually playing extra dimensional chess. SubhanAllah, that's crazy. Okay, even Fernando didn't like that one. This is similar to the fine-tuning argument. Yeah, so actually, let me explain to you the conditions of it. And Razan said, I think about this all the time. And I, you know, this is something that as Muslims, we're told to reflect over, the signs of Allah, right? So the first part of the claim is irreducible complexity. Things are way too complicated for it to be randomly existing. Way too complicated for it to randomly just be here or to just merely evolve. It's way too complex. The second is known as the fine-tuning argument. The possibility and probability of life coming into existence is far too low, statistically low. Probability-wise, it's too low for it to not have an intervening force. That intervening force would be God. And the last one is beauty. When you look around at the world around you, there's so many things that are amazing. There's so many beautiful elements of the creation for it to be through evolution, because it is not a necessary trait that's retained or necessary even for creation to have beauty. So its existence shows that there is a force behind its design, the fact that you can find beauty in it. Do you like this argument? Man, y'all not feeling any of these. The last time I did this at a college campus on the East Coast, people were all into this. Y'all are haters. All right, Sister Amber says she loves it. Brother Ahmed says he likes it. Does someone want to try to use this against me?
I mean, can't you say that beauty is kind of what drives evolution? It's like the prettiest peacock is the one that passes on its genes.
Well, no, because not every bird is pretty.
That's true, but like the pretty flowers get pollinated.
Well, that's more a matter of pollen production. I don't think bees care if the flower is pretty as much as we do.
It's the color and the design behind it that attracts the bees.
Okay, so some flowers
But
are aesthetically
what
more
would be your
pleasing than
definition
others.
of beauty?
Yeah. For
Everyone
Fernando,
has a different type of definition for that regard, so it will make it very subjective. And it also know everything in life has a purpose. We even have something that I don't know how it is called in our bodies that has no purpose at all. You can remove it and nothing changes.
Well, you can't say that it has no purpose. It's just we might not know what its purpose is yet.
No, it is proven that it has no purpose. I just don't remember how it is called in English. I'm so sorry for that part.
this is actually what Ali was referring to when he talked about evolution being a proof against this. There's a lot of examples of stuff like that, scientifically. And Sister Winnie said, we get in there. Sahar said, some things don't have meaning. That's true. It is true. Some things literally do not have a meaning, at least that we're aware of, right? We never play the devil's advocate, but we will play the contrarian for this. AI and emergent behavior work too much against this. Okay, Hamza, he's speaking from the lens of that. Relax, Ibrahim. He's speaking from the lens of that AI, emergent behavior, stuff like that. Nadir Rasi said, I like it, but we only see a small part of the universe. So can we be aware that there isn't disorder elsewhere in the universe? And there's a whole theory called chaos theory that kind of speaks to this a little bit. So
Okay,
he said
here's something that I keep thinking, that especially in regards to beauty and creation and whatever. So on one hand, we can't imagine God. On the other hand, we have this reference to beauty in terms of what exists in nature. But then if you couldn't imagine God, how can you imagine something that you weren't used to before? So for example, if we take everything to the start and we say that, okay, somebody originated that, or it just happened to exist somehow, and we're saying there's cause and effect and whatever, then wouldn't this itself be proof in terms that there is a God? Because there is something that exists that you can't imagine, but you're able to see it, you're able to feel it, you're able to touch it, smell it, hear it, and so on and so forth. Like even our own metabolic systems are the way our body functions, because we don't have control over a lot of things, especially like the beating heart or the way our thoughts move in and out and so on and so forth.
And I really like that point, talking about the design and then talking about control. Right? Even the absence of control in many ways points, but this could just be a part of evolutionary design. This could just be a part of your ergonomical design. Maybe the reason why human beings were able to survive for millions of years is because of the influx of these types of things. Evolution would be used to refute many of these points, unfortunately. But in general, argument by design is a pretty solid one. It's a pretty solid one. We just got, actually, never mind, ignore what I said earlier. I don't think that makes sense. It does make sense. And Luis, he said, I think he means adaptation. So yeah, there is a difference between natural selection, adaptation, evolution. Some of these parts have scientific validity in terms of their laws, and some are still theoretical. Some also have some socio-political influence, and we'll also be addressing that down the road when we talk about the social arguments for and against God's existence. Sahar said, if you were to believe in the multiverse, it would make sense that everything randomly exists. Well, there's also the concept of quantum entanglement, not to get too deep into my quantum mechanical bag, but the concept of quantum entanglement, where you take two atoms, no matter how far apart you put them, when one does one thing, the other does the exact same thing. I mean, that's not random. That implies intelligent design, even on the building blocks of all of creation, which are atoms. But let me point out some of the fallacies of the cosmological or the teleological argument. The first is there is a false analogy here, all right? which is, does design always imply purpose? Does design always imply intent? Just because something has a design does not necessarily mean that it implies purpose. In fact, empirically, you can observe that we create a lot of stuff that doesn't always necessarily have a purpose. I'm looking at this coffee cup here, and there's some extra stuff on it, and honestly, it's just there for design, but it doesn't necessarily have a purpose. I mean, you can look around you. I like to spin things, you know. I'm the type of person that spins things often. I have these complicated tops and stuff. There are some components of it that does have like intelligent design. The heavier the top, the longer it'll spin. But there's some other elements to it. It doesn't have to be this color. I mean, we can observe that in ourselves. You can also observe that in the creation. But you know, the atheists, they have a very, very specific argument for this, and it really sucks. Do you want to hear it?
Go ahead.
It's called the beaver analogy. When a beaver creates a beaver dam, right? In their beaver dam, in their beaver world, when you see the dam, it does have a purpose, right? If beavers were to create a god based on their own intelligent design and the things that they have in their own environment and how they utilize tools and build things together in their community, do you think that they would believe in a beaver god? Would they say that there's a beaver god that in our beaver world gave us the intelligent design to create our beaver homes and our beaver communities and beaver everything? So is there a beaver god? This is actually an argument that goes back to the first atheists, the first historical atheist, which back in the day, it wasn't called atheism, it was called skepticism, of a Greco-Roman philosopher by the name of Xenophanes. Xenophanes, he said, if cows could had the intellect that humans do, then instead of creating Zeus and instead of creating Dionysus and instead of creating the gods that we make, they would just make them all cows. They would just make them all cows, right? So this is from the earliest forms of atheism. It's only because we see the design in our society, in our creation, in our capacity, that we then attribute it to a higher power. It could be that we ourselves are the ones that are implying intent. It doesn't necessarily mean that intent is implied. Occam's razor is something that's used a lot in philosophy. And I want, especially for those of you in Dawa, I swear it's not going to be like this every class. This is just the logical stuff. So we had to get philosophical on, you know what I'm saying? So hopefully it's not a bad grade, but Occam's razor is used to remove the excess from every single argument. Do not add your assumptions. Don't add what you think. Don't add what you feel. Use Occam's razor to trim it all the way down. You will eventually have to discuss the designer. Eventually, you will have to discuss who created everything. When you use Occam's razor and you trim all the extra stuff, okay, so who designed the designer? What is the design of the designer like? What does that mean? How does that look? What is that like? That kind of defeats the purpose of having a supreme architect, whenever the supreme architect can also be something that is designed. And then you'll fall into this vicious cycle. And the last one, which is probably the worst point for teleology, is the lack of perfection. Is it intelligent design that everything that we witness in the creation is intrinsically imperfect? Is that a part of intelligent design to make something that will die? Is it a part of intelligent design to make something so fragile, a squishy human beings locked in our homes for a year because of a small virus? Is that a part of the intelligent design? And you can see how this then becomes an emotional argument. When he said, doesn't the beaver argument assume that God is like creation? Yes, it does. But whenever you imply intelligent design, you're automatically anthropomorphizing God. Because you have intelligence, you're saying that that creator has intelligence too, because it created things with design that is an attribute of intelligence. So giving that attribute to God in teleology is immediately anthropomorphism. What stops you from adding more? Now, I am the worst arguer to argue with when it comes to stuff like this. So I went out of my way to make sure that anything you heard, you would either see some good in it and be like, that makes sense, but the rest of it, you'd look at with one eye closed. Because the point is the counterpoint. When you are in Dawa or you're dealing with other faith groups, they're going to see these flaws. They may not be able to articulate it quite like I did, but they will see these flaws. And because the reason for that is because all of the things that I mentioned are human. This is from human intellect. This is what people think. This is what people feel. You've never met Anselm. You've never met Aquinas. You've never met people who came up with the teleological argument. But all of it is human. And when we talk about the emotional arguments, next time we come together, we talk about the emotional arguments, inshallah, for and against God's existence. We're going to talk about the problem with evil. That people used to say, if God is so merciful, then why is there evil? Or what's the other one?
Why did he create
Nihilism,
disease?
or logical positivism, and all these different things. That the disease comes under the heading of the problem of evil. But for example, why would God give me so many rules? That's not fair. Then we start talking about these emotional things that people come up with to disbelieve in a higher power. I think, I feel. Right now we're on I think. Then next time we will talk about I feel and really get deep in our feelings on that. But because these logical arguments are still very human, eventually you will see how it breaks down. Nasi asked, aren't humans made in the image of Allah? There is a hadith about that, but we talked about it in our comparative religious studies class. It requires a lot more ta'wil, a lot more interpolation than I can give at this time. Then someone said directly, you could argue them by saying maybe imperfection is a part of a perfect design in order to control, no human wants to make a robot that is completely autonomous, for example. And I do like that counterpoint. But one of the biggest issues with the teleological argument is that it doesn't mean that it's just God. Some people use the teleological argument to say that aliens put us here, that they are the intelligent power that put us here. They seeded life on the earth. It's a really dumb argument, and I didn't want to waste your time with it, but yeah. So the counterpoint, on one hand, by these definitions, like God is greater than can be conceived. Well, Jesus was someone that was perceived. Muhammad was someone that can be perceived. The Buddha was a person that walked on the earth. Some people will say like God is in us, or unified consciousness, or we're all a part of God, and God is everywhere, and God is in you, and God is in me. If we can perceive it by the ontological argument, it can't be God. None of us are first causes. Jesus was not a first cause. Muhammad was not a first cause. Buddha was not a first cause. You are not a first cause. So by the cosmological argument standards, you also cannot be God, but also intelligent design. We did not construct the universe. So we also ourselves cannot be the teleological explanation of God. So even though it does have logical fallacies, and maybe you would never use it, you can also see how that explanation means that other faith groups can't use it either, because it does define God to a certain extent. And all of that comes from the word in Arabic, aql, intellect. But aql is not enough for you to know God. Intellect, logic alone is not enough for you to know God, because you can have logic but lack knowledge. You can have knowledge but lack understanding. And you can have all three of those things but lack faith. Because faith does not always conform to your logic, because there are things that exceed your capacity to understand. And we all have to acknowledge something greater than ourselves. Whether we say that is ourselves, or we say that it's Jesus, or we say that it's Buddha, we say that it's whatever. There is also, if God is so merciful, how could he condemn us to hell? Yeah, we're going to talk about that next month in the emotional arguments. Okay, so now we got a little Bible verse, I see. I think that philosophical arguments to prove or argue God's existence are a little bit moot. Abstracting God into philosophical argument breaks away from what is really meaningful, God's relationship with humankind. Jesus said, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not see the kingdom of God, Matthew 18:3. I think it's not so much of a thing to reason yourself into. I think it's something you have to have faith for. Genesis 15:6 says that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him as righteousness. And to our brother, let me see your name here, Jake, this is a really good point. But the problem is, whenever you are using a source for your explanation of God, the source now has to come under scrutiny. You see, the reason why we could scrutinize the ontological, teleological, and cosmological argument is because the source is human. And the same reason why atheists, and take it from someone who read the Bible 13 times cover to cover in seven different translations, from New International Version, New International Translation, even the New World Translation of Jehovah's Witnesses. I even read the Mormon Bible. As someone who knows the Bible like the back of his hand, and as someone who, alhamdulillah, memorized the Quran too, I can tell you right now that there are historical issues that exist with using the Bible as a source to define God. So whenever we postulate or put forward a claim, it can be picked apart. It can be picked apart, and it will be. Could you send me, could you link me to those? Yeah. And if you want to talk offline, I'll share my email again I'd love to meet with you via Zoom or some socially distanced coffee. So the atheists will reject all of this because they say it's illogical, right? They say that this is illogical. And the agnostic, or the person who says, I believe in God, but I don't know what God is. I'm waiting for some experience to know God. I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Those types of folks, they will speculate through empirical evidences what God is or is not. This all makes sense to me. It's all one God, it's all about the hearts, that type of thing. And other faith groups will use this to lead to their own theological positions, because based on everything I shared with each and every single one of you, my brothers and sisters in humanity, this definition is way too fluid, too subjective. I studied philosophy at 2 different universities. It's way too subjective. I will tell you, I did it for you. Never ever waste another hour and 20 minutes of your life doing this ever again. You've heard it. You've heard it. I did it for you. This is like Ibn Taymiyyah's refutation of the logician. He talks about all the philosophy, even Al-Ghazali in his Ihya, and he goes in on philosophy. We did it for you. You don't have to do it. So then the question becomes, what does Islam say? This is what we're here for. We want to know. I will tell you, as someone who is not better than you, smarter than you, or anything more than you, I will tell you that Islam's explanation of God is the most logical explanation. As someone who was everything from a Christian to a Satan worshiper, a multidisciplinarian, an atheist, who studied philosophy in depth, dabbled in multiple denominations of Christianity, someone who is literally a walking book, and I say that with la fakhr, I'm not bragging. You can ask the people who know me. This is the best. This is the best. Why? Because the definition of God is static. It's not fluid. We're not making this up, which makes it objective. Humans cannot describe God. You can't make up what God is, no more than I can make up what medicine is. I cannot make up what science is. I cannot make up reality. I can't look at what you say and say, I reject your reality and substitute it with my own. God is not subjected to our concept of reality or intelligence. So God is what God is, and what God is not, God can never be. I know it's a bit of a tongue twister, but memorize this. God is what God is, and what God is not, God can never be. And you can only know God by how God describes God's self. So what are you using to know God? Are you using someone else's logic? Are you using your own intellect? Are you using the Bible? Are you using the Quran? What are you using? What are you, your source? You can't just make this stuff up. No more than you can just go in your bathroom, get a bunch of chemicals, and start making up medicine. This ain't Full Metal Alchemist. Clap your hands and then you just spawn some stuff. Shout out to the anime heads. This ain't Dragon Ball Z. Kamehamehas ain't just coming out your palms. This ain't no ninjutsu. You can't just do some hand signals and just spawn a toad. This ain't no ninjutsu. All right. So if the concept of God is compartmentalized, okay, it will always be scrutinized because not everything about God is realized. You know what I'm saying? Little bars, big baby bars. If the concept of God is merely compartmentalized, it will always be open to be scrutinized because not everything about God is being realized. What do I mean by that? You want to use cosmology, but you're not talking about what God wants you to do. You want to use teleology, that still doesn't tell you about your relationship with God. You want to use ontology, that's fantastic, but that still does not talk about why God put you here. It doesn't define your purpose. You want to talk about the Christian version of God? Okay, well, that means we have to address a couple of things intellectually, objectively. You want to say there's no God? Well, that needs a discussion too. If you start to break God into these little pieces and fit it through your paradigm of what you're comfortable discussing, we can never truly know God. Understand? So for us as Muslims, we say God has components that you must know in order to actualize the understanding of God itself. God is the creator, which means God is the fashioner, sustainer, and maintainer of everything that God created. And God does not need the creation. God created the creation. That's known as Tawheedul Rububiyyah in Arabic. God is divine, not like anything in the creation beyond your imagination and anything that can be conceived. This is called Tawheedul Uluhiyyah in Arabic. Ibadah, worship. That means that God put you here for something, Surah Al-Dariyat, chapter 51, verse 56. He created you to worship him. What does that look like? That's Tawheed al-Ubudiyyah. How do you know who God is? Don't you know Jesus' real name was never Jesus? It was Yeshua. The Buddha, is that really what he called himself? Whatever it is that you believe in, even Yahweh, if you say Yahweh, it's not even how you say it in Hebrew. It's Yavivave. You want to pray to Yavivave today? Is that what you want to do? You see how it gets tricky? No. God has names and God has attributes. God has descriptions. Where do you get that from? You have to get it from God. So between the creator, the lordship, the divinity, the right to be worshipped alone without partners, God's names and attributes all together, this is how we know God. So then the question becomes, how do I know why Islam? You like that? Are we at the top of the mountain yet? Do you see what I see? Do you see what I see? Same building, different views? How do I know? Because we say our source is from God, not from people narrating from God, not from someone else's intellect, none of those things. We say that our source is from God. Quran is from Allah. It's not from Muhammad. And no Muslim ever said Quran is from Muhammad. Not a single Muslim will ever say that. Even Muhammad, he never said it's my Quran. It's not his. It's from Allah. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, whenever Moses was addressing his people before he died, he said there will come a prophet who only speaks in the name of God. There's no other human being in history that could fit that description except Muhammad. He literally would start the recitation of every chapter of the Quran in the name of God, quite literally. There's a categorical distinction between verses in the Quran and hadith. If I were to say a hadith to you in Arabic and I were to say an ayah to you in Arabic, you'd be able to see the difference between the two. I was talking about the guy who just poked his head into Ibrahim's screen about this earlier. May Allah bless you. Ameen. So the Quran is not a book that says, is God real? You need to understand that. That's not the purpose of this book. The Quran is a book that is asking you a question that with each page, each verse that you read, you get this. If God were to say something to you, what would God say? If God were to say something to you, what would God say? Right? So now in the Quran, we see epistemology. We see branches of knowledge. In the Quran, we see eschatology. We see what happens to you when you die. We see the purpose of life in it. But how do I know that the Quran can be a source used by God or used to say that this is from God? 4 primary points. The Quran has been preserved. And you can go Google something on the internet and come back and say, oh, I heard this, that. No. Come ask the people who studied it. We have 14 centuries of Islamic academia. You have a question about Quran preservation? Alhamdulillah, that's one of the sciences that I specialized in. Come and ask me about it. We'd love to talk about it. But your little Google, YouTube video, whatever have you, that's not going to do it. I'm sorry. So we know the Quran has been preserved, and even Orientalists, even enemies of Islam have attested to this. It's been preserved. In fact, I know at least 5 people in this chat right now that memorized the whole book. And I'm not including myself. The second is it's inimitable. Inimitable. What does that mean? You can't imitate it. You cannot imitate this book. Now, if you pull up for another class that we're going to be doing in a few weeks, if you join these chats and stuff, you'll get the announcements and everything. If you join these classes, you'll see exactly why the Quran is something that you can't imitate. And it's a challenge in the book itself. Make something like this. You can't. It's been around for 14 centuries. Don't you think that there would have at least been 3 copies of the Quran by now if someone could do it? The third is it's immutable. You can't change a single part of the Quran. The minute you change it, it's no longer the Quran. If I say Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, I didn't say Quran. It's Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The minute I change one little thing, one little squiggly line of the doohickey with a dot, if I move it, it's not the same thing anymore. Immutable, can't be changed. And it's prophetic. It has prophecies in it. The testament of prophethood is that it's 100% accurate. It's ain't Nostradamus. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong. Do you know how many Christian denominations, and I actually did a paper about this when I was in seminary. Do you know how many Christian denominations predicted that Jesus would come back and they were wrong? You know how many times in the past 200 years they've been wrong? Too many times. And what does it say in the Quran in the 31st chapter, in the 31st chapter, in the last verse, the 34th verse? Only God knows whenever the end of times will come. And it's not a cop-out. It's not, Jake, I'll go ahead and correct you now as someone who studied the Bible academically. It's not the same argument because we know historically that the Bible has not been preserved, that the Bible is something that has been and can be imitated, that it is something that has been changed. We can actually track its historical changes, and that prophecies in the Bible have not held up to the testament of time. Not even to just point out the prophecies in the book of Revelation, which is its own discussion, but also to talk about the prophecies of Daniel and many others. Pretty much the best prophecy in the Bible that has come to pass is the messianic one, which we as Muslims, of course, believe in. Let me just address something real quick, Jake. I know you coming in with the heat. I see you. Just give me a minute. Just give me like 3 minutes. All right. Let me wrap up. So anyone who needs to go, they can go. All right. So someone messaged directly. Someone said Muhammad hallucinated the Quran like tongues, and when you say it is from God, they just cannot comprehend it and also claim it's plagiarized. I mean, only person who would say this is somebody who has absolutely no knowledge of it, and that's not even like on some, or they don't know Arabic. Like, bro, we do a whole class on this. We'll drop a whole class on this. It's not even an issue. All right. Now, before we talk to Jake, shout out to Jake. Is there anyone who has any other questions, comments, concerns, additions, omissions, suggestions, or objections to anything that we've talked about today?
Yes.
Yes.
To me, this argument still doesn't satisfy the question of what to do if a person I'm talking to doesn't even believe in God or isn't even accepting of the fact, like, how do I convince him that, yeah, Quran is the person, or Quran is the correct way of looking at things? Wouldn't it just be turned on me and say that you have your perception and the other person has theirs? Like the argument of, like, if cows were as intelligent as us, they would have their own version of a religion or something like that. So wouldn't that, like, this thing doesn't help satisfy my question as a non-believer, in terms that why would I believe in your version of the God, or why would I even accept that there is a God?
Well, that's actually the beautiful thing about the Islamic argument. Our job is not to convince you that God is real or not. In fact, the Quran itself does not even try to convince you if God is real or not. Show me one time in the Quran. Just go ahead. Like I said, we have people memorize the whole book here. Tell me where God is convincing you that God is real. I'll wait.
Isn't there a story of a man that was out in the desert, and then Allah killed him, subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he brought him back to life, and then he brought back his donkey as well right in front of him?
This is the story in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, and it starts at like verse 200 258 to 264. It goes from that story about some said that it's Uzair, and others said that this is actually Ilyas or Elijah, the prophet Elijah from the Bible. It wasn't that he died, that God killed him in the desert. It wasn't that God just killed him in the desert. He remained for 100 years. He saw a place that was in ruins, and it was not about the existence of God. It was about how God resurrects. And it goes from that story to another story about Abraham, from this story to that one. And it talks about it sequentially like that. Not about the existence of God, but the nature of resurrection, which is about eschatology, what happens to you when you die, afterlife type stuff. So different discussion there.
I understand.
What about the questions Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raises in the Quran? I forget which, I think it's either Surah Al-Dhariyat or around that surah area, but he raises questions that are like, were you created from nothing, or did you create yourself?
These are the verses in Surah Tur, the 52nd chapter of the Quran, in the mid-30s. Those verses there from like 34 to like 42. In the 52nd chapter of the Quran. Dhariyat is the 51st. So when it comes to these chapters and these questions, this comes under the literary form of the Quran known as Jadala. They're not rhetorical questions, but they're questions that already imply the answer to it. So it's like me asking you, are you on Zoom? It's not to convince you if you're on Zoom or not. It's telling you the reality of it. It's just acknowledging it in the form of a question.
Also, one last question.
Go ahead.
Let me address what Sister Isra said.
Yeah, go ahead.
So really, here's the distinction, right? And we'll close at this point for anyone who needs to go, because I don't want to keep you up late. When it comes to this concept when it comes to this concept of God, right? The Muslim argument for God is, if we're going to talk about God, we need to have a pre-established definition of what God is. Like, if you want to talk about God, that's fine. If you don't believe in God at all, okay, well, explain what is your evidence for this. We are evidence-driven people. In fact, I challenge each and every single one of you. If you know someone who believes in something and they say that it's the key to salvation, bring them. We want to talk to them. I would love to be saved. It's not about being right. It's about salvation. So if you run into people who are not interested in the discussion of God or salvation or any of those things, it's not your job to convince them to believe. It's your job to at least let them know that you are Muslim. And what does that mean? We're not terrorists. We're not weirdos. We're not a cult. We're not anything trying to storm the Capitol. We're not storming the Capitol out here. All right. We're not trying to make America great again. So bearing that in mind, when you put it in this context, our job as Muslims is one of three things. At the base level, let people know what a Muslim actually is. From there, at least inform people of what Islam is. And once they become clear on it, if they know that this is the truth, then to become Muslim and to accept them and to give them a place. But these are our three primary objectives. That's what the dawah is geared towards. Not arguing, not shaming, not putting people down or anything like that. So for us as Muslims, it doesn't become a job to convince. It's our job to just put the evidence there. Because like we mentioned at the beginning with the concept of wahdatul haqq, the truth is a standalone doctrine. You put it in front of people. If they take it, that's fine. If they don't take it, at least they know what your truth is. And when we all die, we'll all know the truth. That's where we leave it. Lakum dinukum waliya din. So that's where we at in the game. Isra, I hope I satisfied you with this.
Yeah,
I
you
have-
did. It makes sense in terms that it's not our job to convince. It's our job to show evidence, or it's our job to just show what we
Exist.
believe in, why we believe in. Yeah, and then
Cut
the
this
truth
from
is
the recording team. Yeah,
but
that's
I
right.
do have a question.
Go ahead, Fernando.
Nice try. So, okay, so this is the deal. You mentioned, and this might be one of the dummy question of the day, but that's why I'm asking it. I never read the Quran. And you mentioned that if you remove a single word, it loses its meaning because it comes directly from God. But I don't know the language that is in the Quran. So let's say like I read a translation, but the translation will never be, it will be a translation. So that will limit, to some extent, those who will have access to this book that is directly from God. So I don't know if you understand what I mean. So for example, if I want to read the Quran and I read it, that would not be the words of God based on the argument. That means that I have to learn the language and be able to understand.
Excellent question, Fernando. You're freaking me out because you got a camera over here where the audio
I
is coming
know.
from.
I'm
You're looking at me
I'm
right
sorry,
here.
but it's like pakata. But then I have over here, so it's like I'd rather be on my laptop. But my laptop
I'm in the
right now-
matrix right now. It's all right. I'm with you. I'm with you. So to address this, it's actually a really good question. First off, you have to understand that the level of nuance that goes into translating the Quran. Whenever you read a translation of the Quran, you're reading an explanation of the verse in that language. Okay. So that's why when it comes to versions of translations, it's actually a very meticulous process where people translate it according to the meaning. It's not even like a word for word Arabic to English translation like that. So even when you read it, you're still connecting with it. There are Qur'ans in Urdu. There are people, from subcontinental Asia who speak the language of Urdu, and they read the Qur'an in Urdu in their translation. I'm an American. English is my first language, and I read it in English. In fact, in memorizing the Qur'an, ask most people. When I quote the Qur'an, I quote it in English. It's my mother tongue. So I'm more comfortable quoting it in that. Most of my audience are English speakers. When I explain the Quran, I oftentimes will rarely ever use the Arabic of it, because the premise of using the translation is to give you an explanation. So if you wanted to like learn it, you wouldn't memorize it in English, but you can understand the general meaning in English. So you're not being deprived in that way. In fact, you should read it. You should read it in whatever language is available to you. Even if Spanish is easier for you, you should read it in that. There's an organization called Porque Islam. and they have like a ton of materials in Spanish that you can read, and it give you just as much access as you need. So the language barrier is not really one that exists, because even people who speak Arabic are not the masters of the ones who memorize the Quran. Most of the people who memorize the Quran, memorize the entire book from A to Z, from the first page to the last, don't speak Arabic. So yeah. Anyways, I hope I answered your question. Now I know my boy Jake has been waiting for a while. I got two questions in the DMs. Let me just address these real quick. How would you refute someone who says the universe is eternal? The universe has an origin, a verifiable origin. It has a verifiable. Scientifically, no one has ever claimed that the universe is eternal. That sounds more like an opinion than something that's based in like actual logic or reason, or even science. So yeah, that would be a preferential belief. That's not like an evidential one. By the way, do you actually get 72 virgins? Law? Don't you know everyone is a virgin in Jannah, in heaven? This whole thing about 72 virgins, well, I swear to God, I have no idea where it comes from. People harp on that like it's the biggest deal under the sun. Like, I mean, I don't filter heaven through the lens of virgins. I think that just came from a bad joke from Team America. If you know the movie, then you from like that popular culture references in the early 2000s post 9/11. I think that's where a lot of this stuff took off from, if I'm being perfectly honest. So do you actually get 72 virgins? You'll be a virgin. Everyone's a virgin. It's not like it's I think the translation is really bad. It's not virgin in the sense of like hold on.